Hi, everyone. Thanks for letting me be here today. I'm just going to take my phone out so I don't talk over my time because I have a tendency to do that. Thanks to Natasha for letting me speak today. I saw this conference and I called her right away and said, why didn't you invite me to speak at this? And so she graciously let me come and talk to you today. So I want to give you a bit of background to explain where I'm coming from to talk to you about Indigenous data sovereignty. I work currently for a firm called INQ, as was said. INQ does both law and consulting, and we focus exclusively on privacy, data governance, AI, and cybersecurity. But before that, when I first started my career, I moved to the Northwest Territories. And I had this idea that it was going to be this sort of like romantic experience, and I'd be flying across the territories, like saving lives and and all that. But really, that's not. Well, it didn't save any lives. But that experience shaped me in ways that I wasn't really fully anticipating, and I learned a lot of things that I didn't expect, and that has to do with Indigenous privacy and Indigenous data rights. So I focused always on privacy at that time. I wasn't thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty. I don't think it was top of mind, really, outside of the Indigenous realm. And so I did that for a bit, and then I went on to work for the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Nunavut and Northwest Territories. And I remember this case that I had. I was investigating a privacy breach. And what had happened was it was a fly-in community. And the housing department at the community, so they supported Indigenous people with their housing. It paid for part of it. And this was a community also where there was an alcohol ban, so you had to get permission to have alcohol in the community. And so what happened was the housing authority said to themselves, well, this isn't right. Like, we know people are drinking here, but they're also getting money for their housing. And so they went over and said, we want all the data, we want to know which people that we're giving funding to are also spending their money on alcohol. Because if they're spending their money on alcohol, then we shouldn't be paying for their housing. And I remember being like so disturbed by that and thinking to myself, like, this wouldn't have happened outside of the Indigenous realm. But again, I was focused on privacy, and I continued that privacy focus. As was said, I went to be the Commissioner, Information and Privacy Commissioner here in Nova Scotia up until about last year. And for that role, what I didn't anticipate was, I went in there thinking this is all going to be privacy, but there's a huge focus on access to information and data governance. And so at that time, I started realizing that maybe everything that I was doing wasn't specifically focused on privacy, that we were talking about Indigenous data sovereignty issues. So now that I'm in private practice, I can focus on this. I get to decide what I want to work on for once. And so I've been really looking into this field. And I'm also a member of the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan First Nations, so I have a personal connection to this issue. I didn't look at this yet. Okay, so I want to start with a few things. So one, what is Indigenous data sovereignty? And then I'm going to get into what's on the screen here, which is what's referenced as the OCAP principles. So data sovereignty refers to the right of Indigenous nations and communities to govern information in a manner consistent with their laws, practices, and customs. It's about sovereignty over the collection, use, control, access, possession, and sharing, all those words that we always hear, and sharing of data. It's considered essential in achieving inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to govern their community, their lands, their resources, and their people. And I think probably most importantly, it's an expression of self-government and inherent rights. It's not a policy decision. And typically today, what we see this viewed as is a policy decision or a nice to have, not necessary to have. So what has been developed here on the screen for you is, it's called the OCAP principles. It was developed by the First Nations Information Governance Center, FNIGC. And so these principles are designed to protect First Nations ownership and jurisdiction over their information and data, and address how their data will be collected and used and shared and protected. So these are the principles here. I just want to pause actually before I get into that. So this is these principles are specific to First Nations. Métis and Inuit have their own principles, but currently these principles are sort of, I think I'll say, the furthest along right now, and we only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to focus on this. So the first principle is ownership. And it refers to the relationship of First Nations people to their cultural knowledge, their data, their information. And what's key about this one is ownership is referred to not just specifically as an individual right, which is how we characterize all of our all rights outside the Indigenous realm, I guess. We view it as an individual right, individual consent. And ownership in the Indigenous data sovereignty world means ownership can be collective, so a community can own information about its members, typically collectively. Our laws are not designed for this, so our laws all focus on individual rights, not collective rights. So this is tricky to achieve. Control is the second principle. It refers to First Nations having the right to control all aspects of research and information management in terms of their information about their communities. It's not just about research, it's often framed as research because typically organizations are doing research with Indigenous nations, but it extends beyond that. Access refers to the principles that First Nations should have access to their data about themselves and their communities wherever that data is held. And this is a huge one right now because there really isn't the infrastructure in place for Indigenous nations to house their data. What happens is the data is housed usually with the government or with researchers or whatnot, and oftentimes Indigenous people have a really hard time getting access to that data, even though it's about them, even though it was collected about them. They still are denied access. They often have to go through the ATIP process when you're in government. And then possession is the physical and digital mechanism through which ownership is protected. So these are the principles. And I set them first because it's sort of the way that you should be looking at any AI tool that you're going to use. That if you're going to use it, it should be able to respect those principles. And so Indigenous communities are concerned. They're concerned about using AI tools, and they're rightly concerned about that. And that's because data has historically been used about or collected about nations and used without their knowledge or consent to make decisions about them, to perpetuate biases against them and whatnot. And the worry is that large-scale data collection in AI development, using it to train data sets, using it for algorithmic decision-making, the worry is that that can replicate and amplify historical patterns of extraction and misrepresentation. What happens in that scenario is that communities often don't get any benefit from the systems that were trained using their data. And so I don't think everyone would agree with this. I don't think it's a controversial thing to say that this is a real concern, and a concern about AI being used to impact Indigenous peoples, and that in ways that would not align with principles of Indigenous sovereignty. Sorry, I used to work a lot in Indigenous self-government, so I find myself mixing up the terms. Okay, so that being said, there's the concern, there's the background, there's the historical context, but we know AI is here to stay, and so while there is the concern, the sentiment is not, okay, we're not going to use AI because we can't ensure that it respects Indigenous data sovereignty, but instead, how are we going to use it in a way that does? And what I want to talk to you about for the rest of this presentation is to get into some real specifics. So I'm a lawyer. I like to focus on the practical and how we're going to achieve it. And so I'm going to go through some expectations that you may have when you're in the room using Indigenous data, what you can expect to hear from Indigenous nations. So again, I want to remind you about the collective aspect of the OCAP principles. So it's not just individual data that's being used, but also collective data that's being used. And so, as I said, also, there's not a lot of the laws don't really account for this. And so what's typically being done practically in this space is to use data sharing agreements. And data sharing agreements can establish ownership and access to data that respects Indigenous data sovereignty in a way that the laws really can't right now. So what you should expect to see if you're going to negotiate, if you're going to use an AI tool, you want to use Indigenous data, this is the kind of thing that you should be expecting and the kinds of thing that you should be ready to address. And the first is setting out the ownership of data. So you can expect a community to say, yeah, sure, you might house it, you're going to hold it in your systems, but we own it. And that ownership comes with a lot of things. So it comes with the ability for us, you have to ask us if you're going to use this data, you have to have our consent. We own it, and we can withdraw from the use of the tool at any time and those sorts of things. The second big one is access, as I said. So again, if you don't have the infrastructure, you still can set up provisions, access can be given to any of the data that is being generated by the tool, and this is a huge one. This one comes up in my practice all the time. Communities struggling to get access to information about their community and not being able to use it to seek funding from the government and that sort of thing, but knowing all the while that it's been collected about them, oftentimes without their consent. You should also expect strong provisions on permitted and prohibited uses of the data that's coming out of the AI tool. So typically there is, again, it's often a research-based setting, but there's usually provisions to prevent secondary use for research. And in the AI realm, what we're seeing are provisions that for prohibited use for data training models. What you'll see being expected is that there is community credited and back to the community for any publications using AI data. They want research, if it's in the research context, you want those findings shared back with the community. And likely Indigenous nations will seek veto rights in terms of secondary use of their data. And finally, you'll probably see a lot of requests for provisions relating to audit and accountability rights. And so Indigenous nations are going to want, again, even though they're not housing the data, they're going to want to be able to come in and audit it and see, is this really being used in a way that we consented to, or is there anything that needs to be addressed? And I put a little bit there that this takes time. It takes a lot of time in the Indigenous context because there's a lot more consultation that goes on and a lot more community involvement. And so typically, organizations are coming in, they want to use the tool, they want to do it quickly, they want to, they think they know they're doing the right thing, and so they want to push it forward. But what I think we need to start thinking about as governments, as vendors, as anyone working with Indigenous nations in this realm, is that this burden of creating the data sharing agreement, of ensuring that this takes a step back and follows the steps set out by the community, that burden shouldn't fall just on Indigenous nations. It should fall on vendors, on governments, like they should be building into their infrastructure or into their practices ways to support Indigenous involvement in this. It needs to be built into your timelines, into any ethics requirements, and any funding structures from the beginning. So this is even more down to the practicality. So I want to talk about procurement of AI tools. And so before you're even getting to the procurement stage, these are all the things that you need to think about, and, well, not all of them, a bunch of them. So the first is mapping. So that means which communities' data are you collecting. And honestly, I can tell you this is actually extremely difficult to do in practice. It seems straightforward, but many times you're going to use a tool that you will use data from multiple communities, not just one. And so in order to ensure that's addressed, you have to figure it out, and then you also have to go to the multiple communities or the multiple nations. It can't just be one. When you're doing your PIA, which is your, everyone should be doing a PIA before they use AI tool. It's privacy impact assessment. So when you're running that PIA, you should be not just doing the standard PIA, but also one that considers Indigenous rights and considers whether or not the tool can comply with OCAP principles. And I see this a lot in practice where a government or an institution wants to use a tool, they want to engage with the Indigenous community, they start setting up their data sharing agreement, and they say, sure, we'll just put a little one-liner in here that says we're going to comply with OCAP. And there's real ramifications to that, and it's not just a policy one-liner, we're going to say we're going to do it. It has a whole bunch of implications that need to be followed in order to say that you're going to do that. So in the procurement, like in your contracts, you want to build in community consent and veto rights. And you want to have provisions that require vendors to disclose the provenance of their training data and their retraining schedule before signing any contracts with them. And so once you're at the stage, though, that you've signed your contract, you've retained the tool, you're using it, there are a lot of things that continue moving on, and these all relate to the OCAP principles. So typically this involves reporting to communities on how the tool is being used, what's coming out of it. You want to, again, have the audit provisions that I was talking about. So Indigenous nations are going to want to be able to audit use and reject uses if they believe that harm can be caused by using the data. And consent should be renegotiated before any material model update. And I also want to flag the use of aggregate or de-identified community data. So typically, we'd view aggregate or de-identified data as sort of a privacy out, maybe a little bit. That we're not identifying anyone, so therefore it's not a concern. But with Indigenous communities, oftentimes the AI tool can generate an output that characterizes the community itself, even if you can't identify individual people throughout it. So it can create a community profile, and that profile can be used in ways that it has been in the past to perpetuate biases, to cause harm. But under OCAP, aggregated data about a community remains Indigenous data, and it comes with all the governance obligations that entails. And just a last bit before I conclude, we've talked in this room a lot about the investments that government's making into AI development in tools, and so I want to speak to the issue of Indigenous-led AI development. There's a real difference between tools that are built for Indigenous communities and AI tools that are built by them. And most of what we're seeing right now is AI tools being built by non-Indigenous people. And so we need to be looking at that, is what I would put to you, that you should be considering, the federal government, I'm looking over this way, should be considering funding AI development or AI-led development tools. So there are already examples of this happening. There are Indigenous people who are developing AI tools for example, language preservations. So they're using recordings that they have consent for and they have cultural authorities from the communities to use these protocols or use this information with strict protocols so the data can be shared publicly. But really, we need to talk about this from this happens a lot with Indigenous communities where there's sort of one-off funding being provided. And with AI, we see the numbers that we're putting into data sovereignty with our AI use in Canada. And I think we need to think about, for Indigenous nations, non-conditional sustained funding. So I'll just put that to you for those listening in the room that are making those decisions. And then just at the end, just a key takeaway, none of this is simple. It's actually really, really challenging. This is what a lot of this work comes from this area. For me, I talk to Indigenous nations as well as to vendors and organizations who are trying to implement AI tools. And so it's not simple, but I'm going to put to you that respecting it is what self-determination looks like, and respecting sovereignty by design is what responsible innovation looks like as well. Thank you.